right, so we have Chase and Knightley 1 discussing the prompt class struggle is a myth and also ahistorical. Why don't you guys go ahead and refine what you're going to be discussing tonight?
Well, I guess from my point of view, like if those are two separate propositions, I really don't have much of a problem saying the first, that like class struggle is in some sense mythical, just because I have like a kind of like anthropologist's bent about like the role of mythology in society, and so I guess like that I don't bristle. Um, that doesn't mean it's not also explanatory in some way. But I do bristle at the second proposition that it's ahistorical. Although I guess there's probably like a larger conversation about like what slice of history are we talking about. But yeah, I will let Knightley talk.
Well, I'm coming at this from both a classically liberal position and a historian's position. I studied history as my major in college, and it's been both a hobby and a passion ever since. I love watching how the world develops and how it builds. And the concept of class warfare and its role in is a historical narrative, I find to be an oversimplification of what's happening, and therefore it can't be said to accurately describe what we see in history.
Okay. So, what do you think? I guess, what do you think the explanatory role that class struggle as a concept is trying to fill is, and what do you think would be more adequate replacements? I mean, do you? I guess, like, yeah. Do you think there's a sort of uh, a theoretical prompt for people to be like, okay, this set of things is explicable by invoking this abstraction called class struggle. Do you think there's a better way of describing all the things involved? Because I mean, people go on labor strike. I mean, like, just as an empirical fact, and some people might describe that as like a form of class struggle. I mean, you could try to describe it in another way, though, and not try to like link it up to some more abstract narrative of the flow of human history.
Oh, naturally. And one of the key things, again, coming from that like academic historical perspective, is we have to look at the context of each different age. So it's really hard to draw, a comparing line between events of one age and events of another. Like you mentioned, the union strikes. I'd say that's more. I'd say that's more of a like a group negotiation than a sign of class warfare.
Right. Right. Do you well, you call it a group negotiation? What are the groups involved in a labor strike his situation, social situation?
The employees of a company and the company itself. Sometimes that migrates into an industry and other things.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, those two groups are explicable by certain views on class in a capitalist society, and I mean, is it the jump from what looks like just a dispute between two interest groups becoming like a more totalizing theory of society? Is that kind of where you get off the argument for the existence, or the utility at least, of the idea of class struggle?
Yeah, that's probably a fair way of putting it. I don't think
Okay.
I don't think the class is is a unifying or cohesive group in of itself. There's
Right.
lots of different classes in society. Whatever you decide is a class, is just what it is, and people are parts of different classes at the same time.
Right. I mean, so I don't, I can't like profess to be like a complete expert in, say, Marx, and I'm not even necessarily here to like defend a Marxist position. But I don't think Marx even held to the idea that there were just at any given point in a society or in a social situation, just two classes that were kind of in oppositional conflict with one another. I mean, he talks that way in Capital, but he's working on a really high level of abstraction there. When he talks about like concrete politics in his lifetime, he's always more granular and nuanced in talking about like different elements of the capitalist class or the petty bourgeois. Or when he's talking about the American Civil War, he's very cognizant of the planter class interest in the role in their actions in American politics. So I guess it's kind of like, some of this comes. You say you have a historian's background. I guess I'd be interested to hear your read on other historical situations that I have like a little bit of knowledge on, just because, while I would never make the claim, again, I don't think Marx was making the claim that everything is explicable in terms of like a capital v labor or bourgeois v proletariat dynamic. Those dynamics, I would still say, are still there, and that the world is more complicated doesn't necessarily invalidate the theory. I mean, if the law of gravity states was it 9.8 meters per second is what an object falls in a vacuum. Of course, if you on planet Earth drop a bowling ball and a feather at the same time, the feather will drop slower, but that doesn't invalidate the law of gravity. It just is to add other elements, air resistance and so forth. I mean, so I guess
Well, that's part of where I'm coming from.
is
Marx very much does try to boil it down to just those two groups. He even calls that the structure of history. That's not the term he uses, but I mean, and I was preparing to argue, against the Marxist notion of class and class warfare.
Right. I mean, and I'll defend it. Those propositions. I mean, some of this might be, Marx, how he talks in like the Communist Manifesto about these things versus how he talks in Capital versus how he talks about his like empirical writings on politics are like kind of three different things to some extent. And, that's, it's frustrating because it does mean like one has to like interpret his work, with, you're going to bring your own attitude towards it to some extent, but I mean, do you think, for instance, can I like, let me draw like a sharper, how do you think one person gets another person to work for them? Like, I mean, what are the various ways someone can do that, I guess, from your view?
Like, if I was trying to hire somebody?
So it's like probably like a large or out of left field question, and so
No, that's fine.
sorry if that's like unfair.
No, that's fine. I'm just making sure I'm answering the right question.
I mean, the reason I bring it up is that I've been thinking about this from my own read of history, and one way of getting someone to work for you is to pay them, right? And there's a whole institutional backdrop to making that work, sound currency markets, production, so forth. I mean, another way of uh, getting someone to work for you is just to coerce the labor out of them. Which,
Yeah, you can
go
either
ahead.
trade fairly or you can, use force.
Right. Do you do you think class struggle and class relations between, say, masters and slaves is a more coherent notion than between, say, bourgeois and proletariat? Because I don't, I guess, like, I think about like Roman history, and 20 to 30% of the population is slaves at any given point. The economy's built on it, and there is, not uh, often, but there, is occasionally signs of real like struggle from below on this. But there's also a complicated society involving like manumissions and you know. So I don't want to make like a complete analogy. My point is to say, monocropping in the American South, but I feel like if you can't see the various distinctions between patricians and plebeians, even if it's somewhat self-imposed, uh, like you miss a lot of the story. Um, in
Well, that's what
in
made Rome so interesting. That was the original class distinction, the plebeians and the patricians. But
right,
there was a lot of work done to unite the two. They
right,
shared goals and all. There was some conflict in that, and it was about the difference in institutional power. But it was less about class because even as those clashes were going on, the class roles were already starting to overlap.
right. I mean, but I mean, if you say the class roles were starting to overlap, it means you can understand there being two classes with some, uh, some murky areas in between, right?
Yeah, like I said, there's always lots. There's always lots of ways to classify groups in society.
Right.
I'm not denying
Well,
the existence of classes. I'm
okay.
denying that that the warfare between the classes is the driving notion of history.
Okay. Okay. All right. No, that's yeah, no, that's probably like where the area of disagreement actually is, because I wasn't sure. So it's really the view that that class struggle as a kind of monocausal explanation for historical change. That's kind of the view that you reject.
Correct. Yeah, the
Okay.
monocausal, the dialectic view of class and history.
Okay. 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 Yeah, I can't I guess my see the way I kind of understand Marx is that he and again, like, this is my own interpretation of him, is that um he I think, especially when you read like passages out of Engels where he talks about essentially patriarchy as the first class relation. I think he has a much more capacious view of what class struggle kind of means in those senses, but it definitely he's trying to examine capitalist class relations first and foremost. Um, I don't. I know he writes endlessly in like theories of surplus value and in other places about these issues um, more deeply. But all I can say is when he was actually commenting on the politics of his day, he had a much more granular analysis than just to say like it's all proletariat and bourgeoisie and they're fighting. I mean, for one, he's very aware that these things happen, within and around nation states, and empires, at that point, a lot of them falling apart. So, I mean, uh, so I guess my the reason for that digression is just that I don't think Marx had quite the view that gets often ascribed to him in this sense. that that he just saw, you know, uh, like at any one point just those, two forces. But I could be wrong. That could just be my own misinterpretation of his work. But he's say when he talks about when he makes, and not all of them like the most educated, you know, uh, or enlightened for that matter, observations on what he calls like Asiatic modes of production. He's very cognizant that they might not develop, other societies might not develop along the same lines that bourgeois society had developed. But he thought that there was a aspect to the capitalist mode of production that it had to basically expand and interpenetrate. And that's kind of, I mean, that I guess that's how I read him. But again, I could be wrong. I just think that class struggle, whatever the class is involved, is like a way of talking about history in a coherent way. I wouldn't be ready to defend the proposition though that there's at any one point just like, the ruling class and everyone else, and with no divisions or gradations in between.
Oh yeah, and that's why I oppose the dialect approach that he takes, because that's what it is. He's doing it to create a theoretical structure from which he can extrapolate and predict the future, and build up and build his communist ideology. And and as for whether or not he does it, I don't doubt that he acknowledges the nuance in his own time, in his own place, when he's talking about his time and his place. But he tries to extrapolate through all of history. Like,
Right.
the very first part of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight.
Yeah. Well, he sees antagonism within social structures. I mean, he
Yeah,
sees.
it's
Yeah.
conflict theory. At least that's what it's called now. I don't think that's what it
Yeah.
was called
So,
then.
I mean, do you think no, no, yeah. I mean, do you think to the degree that that's somewhat true that societies emerge from sort of internal conflicts? I mean, do you think that's explicable at all of the world?
I mean, the greater conflict is always man versus nature against supplies. But we are always in competition with each other because there's only finite supplies and essentially unlimited desires and needs. We will always need and want things, and so it's always the challenge of getting those needs and desires to the people.
Yeah, I guess I start from really different premises about um human nature maybe. I mean, there's I mean at current moment our condition is really one of abundance in a lot of respects. I mean, even if the ravages of ecological change really kick into high gear. I did the like math, and if we all converted to a potato diet, we could feed with the arable land on planet Earth 4.25 trillion people. I mean, like it would mean changing lifestyles, but people change lifestyles. I guess like I don't come from the view that the fundamental ecological condition of human beings is one of scarcity, and our desires are endless. I mean, I don't quite. I guess that seems to me like an imputation that I don't quite see the need for. So if you want to defend it, I'd love to hear you argue it out a bit.
Yeah, that's fine. And I mean, it just boils down to do you want to only eat potatoes for the rest of your life?
No, but if
Exactly. Yeah.
no, but if the conditions required it, I certainly could be happy to. I mean, I'll put it this way: um, I'd rather eat potatoes for the rest of my life than for the planet Earth to become unlivable.
And so would I. There's a lot of things I'd rather do. We always have to make those decisions.
Sure, sure, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that means though that like human beings' natural proclivity is to like uh, not be like happy eating potatoes more than they currently are. I mean, it's human beings have come up with a incredible diversity of visions of what a good life is. Most of which didn't involve endless economic growth as a precondition for it, or market competition, sort of the structures of capitalist society.
But we never rationally thought about, well, I'm not sure that's the right term, but we never focused exclusively on market exchange until, relatively recently in history. But we
Right,
know that trade and trade and competition have been going on since prehistory.
right.
We found evidence of trading networks through hunter-gatherer societies going back tens of thousands of years and extending thousands of miles.
Right. Well, I mean, I would caution that trading networks might be, is kind of one. There's like a degree of interpretability with all this evidence, and
Well,
I'm
absolutely, but you can only interpret finding in Africa materials that are only found at the time in like modern day Arabia.
right, but you can't assume that they were trading like there was a monetary market in place to
Oh, there was
explain that. I
a
mean, people were traveling and moving around for sure, but
yeah, but we have evidence of the of an exchange. We know hunter gatherer societies made things for ornamentation, for decoration, and we have evidence of them trading. Things found in groups. We know they had a sense of ownership because the burials will have possessions with them.
sure, that's that's different than barter and market exchange, though. A lot of I mean, it's. I mean, it's been. I guess like I'm not going to go down too far on the social anthropology literature just because I don't want to misquote anyone. But from what I've read, I mean, it's not been an observed phenomena within the ethnographies of hunter-gatherer tribes that people engage in barter in the way that, I mean, people will engage in gift economies and have like a basic sense of debts and uh, and a range of other practices, but um, it's not like there was market exchange in place prior to you know uh,
Well, of course not. You couldn't have market exchange until you had a stable market.
right.
Different groups would encounter each other, and usually it was more beneficial to exchange things than to fight.
I I guess then I would want to ask, what makes the uh, current market, the current economy distinct from the ones in earlier periods? I mean, because it does seem that, I mean, you mentioned the rationality of the economy as being a factor. Maybe I misunderstood you, but
Well, I'm
you
referring to the change in the Enlightenment when we began to try to systematize exchange in economics. Economics as a field of study, not just as a thing people do.
See, and okay, this is I guess what I want to maybe nail down on is because I don't believe there was an economy in that sense prior to that era. I mean, the economy is a kind of reified. You talked about class struggle being a myth. I mean, I feel like the economy is a myth in the sense that it's very much a reified area of social life that, is idealized from actual social processes that people are engaged in. So
Economics is just people who want things trying to get them in a fair and in a for lack of a better term, a civil way. Not fighting and stealing.
yeah, it's so I mean it's when you say that though, I mean when you say people trying to get things, that's an incredibly capacious way of saying almost anything. I mean, people can desire anything. That doesn't mean that they would try to strive for that through a market exchange. I guess I just.
And that's one of the limitations and one of the great misunderstandings of economics, and one of the issues I have with the current approach to it.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is, do you think that economic activity basically pre-existed the Enlightenment in the modern sense of economic activity, but was just kind of repressed or like in fetters of just, I guess what I'm trying to understand how you think through that
economics existed, but it wasn't observed. Like all the factors that we study in economics today were still happening back then. It's just people didn't understand what they were doing in that sense until the Enlightenment period, and they started studying it. Like Marx and Smith and a bunch of the other early and evolving common English.
Right. Well, I guess do you so when I think of the modern economy, I think of the market as being one of the key sort of institutions or ways of approaching it. But most of human beings, I mean, for most of humanity, the market's a really marginal aspect of social life. I mean, production was almost entirely domestic, with what we would consider the domestics of this distinction to some extent has been reoriented. But the word, the Greek word for economy, I think it's okonomiko or something like that, literally referred to household production. And in opposition to the market, which is something outside of it. So I hear your point, like coin money existed in the past too, but all these kind of different aspects of society, I would say, like, it's not so much that the economy existed in a latent form and then we just kind of realized 200 years ago that it did. More like, a configuration of more basic elements.
A better way of me wording it is people, before we started studying economics, people still needed things. People still wanted things, and they only had scarce resources to get or create those things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you, I guess, I mean, there's a range of stuff in, I mean, it's got like the big question about history of the economy is, to my mind, like, why did growth take place when it did? Do you, I'm still kind of stuck on the idea that the economy existed in a sort of primitive form prior to the Enlightenment, but we just didn't realize it. Can you kind of like walk through that process a little bit?
Well, I can do my best. In the beginning, in the beginning, the earliest societies, hunter gatherers, they had what could be found and what could be made simply. We do know some trade happened, and goods got passed from one group to another over great distances. As society settled down, that's when we started getting agriculturalism, uh, or even like in the Americans, the I can't remember the term of it, but it's like accidental agricultural.
Yeah.
Like they just knew where the food would grow in abundance to live off of, and they lived near
Right.
it.
Right.
But that's what led to the specialization of labor, the secure food sources. You didn't have to wander. You didn't have to, you know, you didn't have to always live on that edge. And it was still really tough back then. I mean, famine was still bad, and that's why growth was slow because all they were doing the same thing as they had always done, just in a more organized, slightly more organized manner. Gather, distribute, store. And this is in the early, and this is like the earliest Mesopotamian societies. That's where we have the first records of long distance trade. The world famous A Nashir, the copper merchant who kept all of his angry letters. And that's almost 1,000 years before the invention of currency.
So I I guess again I start from sort of a premise that a lot of our history is actually defined by forms of abundance rather than scarcity. Um, I so that might just be like a fundamental difference in outlook that I don't know if I can really focus on it too much. But I would just caution one aspect of the story you said is, there's archaeological sites, say like in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, I think is the name of it,
Yeah,
and
that's the one.
yeah, I mean that shows that the kind of it's complex in the sense that people are settling down and they're doing things, but we don't see like a rigid hierarchical society coming about, or we don't see, from my understanding, like what looks like a primitive market economy so much as people engaging in making art and the various cultural practices that they're engaged in. I'm sure people came by from the. I mean, I think eventually they were overrun uh, by uh, by another group of people, but I'm that's not to say that people didn't come to the society, exchange objects and things like that. I just don't think it's again, to my mind, about like the historical imposition. I don't think we can assume that that is something analogous to me selling my wages, or sorry, selling my labor for a wage now to buy the food I need because I have to engage in a market economy to survive in the kind of society we have.
Well, yeah, there wasn't the rigidness that we have today. There wasn't the structure. We haven't been building for we haven't been building social structures for 10,000 years ago.
Right. Right. I yeah. Um I'm not I'm interested in like if other people want to chime in a little bit, cuz I'm not sure I have much more to add at this stage, but if you had something you wanted to throw in, or if somebody else wanted to prompt or poke at one of us, I'd be interested in engaging a bit.
Sure. I think that we got a little bit off the topic. I don't know if we ever addressed the actual question as to whether class conflict is a useful narrative in which to view the world, regardless of whether it has some kind of mythical quality to it, right? So we know that
Right.
there's ways of like looking at history that have theoretical um merit to them and like help elucidate things even though they might not be historical facts, because all you would have to choose is that if sorry, not choose. All you have to prove is that if these other factors didn't obtain, then the one that I am arguing would be the thing that obtains, right? So regardless of how history actually developed, if we could just show that class conflict would have obtained regardless of what other factors there are, then I think it would still be a useful theory. And it sheds some light on how like social situations actually evolve out of um historical conditions. So
Right.
do you guys want to speak to that?
Well, my concern with that is if we're more worried about how useful it is to, you know, to convincing others of what we want them to believe, then the accuracy and the reality of it doesn't actually matter, because then at that point it's just the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my position on this, which I read out of my reading, I guess, of Marx. Again, like I can't guarantee the fidelity of his actual view, just my interpretation of him is that we kind of need an abstract understanding of class dynamics to see the concrete reality. But the concrete reality is always like going to be a little bit more capacious and messy than uh, than at that like level of abstraction. I think class struggle is present between slaves and slave owners. I think it's present between workers and employers, or proletariat and bourgeois. I mean, that doesn't explain like every foreign policy action of, say, like the government you live in, but it does, as like the joke goes. I think like it vulgar Marxism explains 90% of the world. Like I do think kind of these brute, say like I'm in California here, and the national government is dumping a bunch of money into uh, industrial production of micro transistor chips because of like supply chain issues for transistors running through Taiwan primarily. And so the uh, the national security legislature and said, we really need to fund manufacturing of this technology here in this country because 90% of the micro transistor chips that we get come through Taiwan, which is politically contested. Now it's like, is the fact that it's a cash windfall uh, for various uh, micro transistor production facilities and corporations like the only explanation for that? No, I mean, like there's, but and in fact the government by doing this is favoring one wing of capital over another in a lot of respects. But it doesn't mean that those dynamics still aren't like in play, I guess. And so I mean, to go what you said, Nietzsche Guevara, like I guess the question is like, does, in the absence of other aspects and things going on in the world, does the theory still obtain? And I think, to a large extent it does. If you see an analogous relationship, if you see struggle between proletariat and bourgeois, or capitalists and workers at all, um, then I think uh, it still has some use.
Okay. Wandering Pause says that it seems that there is a possible conflation of markets and exchange. Um, the conversation on past systems of exchange with relation to yeah. Possibly this loses the connection between modern capital and its relationship to contemporary notions of exchange. Would you guys like to speak to that? Is there a conflation between markets and exchange?
I mean, yeah, I think if I understand their question correctly, I think yeah, that's the crux of the matter is that um, if you understand the economy and economics as just a understanding like a system of exchange and the sort of imposition onto the modern capitalist market economy of just a series of exchanges. I mean, I think like Marx's triumph in capital is to show that behind the exchange of commodities is this class relationship that's sort of fueling the whole thing. And it also to frame the prior eras of history in these terms, I think, obscures the fact that most people in most societies did not live their lives through the market. They didn't sell their labor for a wage so they could buy stuff to survive. That's a very modern condition and historically specific and distinct, is my point.
Well, for me, my working definition of market is simply a place where exchanges are made. And while markets didn't exist in the way they do today in earlier societies, since the founding of agriculture, we have seen the same structures, just as, again, less formally. There was a much smaller urban population, and the urban population is the only one that would be living in our current way. The majority of the people would live on the land doing the farming or away from the social centers doing the hunting and gathering. Yeah, but even then, they would still interface with the market by bringing it in, bringing their wares into town and exchanging.
Yeah.
This is in the few places where the free market did exist. Well, free in a relative sense to the time. Like most of like in the earliest, so the Mesopotamians. Hold on, I'm reading Wandering's message.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's this is kind of like where that just disagreement is, and where I think the I'm sorry, I lost what their name was, who asked the question,
Wandering
but
calls. And
wondering,
to
yeah,
answer, if I may interrupt for a second to answer
go
his
for it.
second question. Um, well, part of my point, Wandering, is that state actors aren't necessary to markets. Markets exist without states. States are supported by markets and support markets in change, but they aren't necessary to each other.
Where when an exchange takes place, what's being exchanged precisely in your view?
I mean, that would depend on the transaction.
Right. I mean, do you? I mean, I guess my thing is with what you just said is that while markets uh, markets I mean to some extent I think markets don't need the blessing of a government, hence black markets, but they do need some element of sovereignty and coercion in order for private property to even be alive. I mean, you'd still need, people uh people guaranteeing that the transaction is fair in some sense. Doesn't need to be a state, but it usually ends up being guys with guns.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and that's especially in the sense of private property. Uh, what the state or state-like entity, if we're incorporating older societies into it, what they do is they provide that expansion of, I get for lack of a better term, of right. Without states, without governing body, you only own what you can hold. And if
For
this,
sure, but in that sense, aren't markets dependent on states? Dependent on the security and order that states provide?
no, because you still you can, even without states, you can still own what you can hold.
Yeah, I mean, you can own it if you can attack the person who tries to, take it from you. If that's the or if presumably if no one wants it to begin with, you can hang on
Or
to
no
it
one's
forever.
there. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
that's why it's
but
not the ideal. That's why I'm not an anarchist.
right, right. But I mean, my point is that it still seems to me that sorry, my cat is bothering me. It still seems to me that that markets involve a kind of principle of sovereignty. Even if it's just that the two parties involved, you know, promise to not cheat one another when they might be able to invoke coercive, violent powers in order to do so. I mean, like that's why I don't want to say markets require a state, but they do require a lot of the things that the state does. I mean,
Okay, I have a question for Knightley. Do you do you say that you don't think class struggle is the best way to view history in like a monolithic sense, but do you think that class struggle elucidates anything about historical events, especially post like French Revolution? Maybe we can go from there.
Well, post French Revolution and the early days of the revolution is when we started when some people started developing class identities. That started being how we well, that's only partially fair because we did have more hierarchical societies even in the Middle Ages. But that's but much like economics, the Enlightenment periods where we started really rationalizing those social structures, and that's when it became more than just this group does this, that group does that, and it became this is what I am, and that's where class or class conflict really does start become relevant
so,
as much
so
as it
you
can.
do you think? I mean, from my understanding, you did think that there was a class society, something analogous to a class society in Rome, though, as well. Did I misunderstand you?
Uh, no, you didn't. There was definitely a class society in Rome, patricians and plebeians and slaves, but it wasn't the
Okay.
conflict between those classes that drove the entirety of Roman history.
No, no, I can't. I wouldn't state that. I mean, for one, I guess if there's a weakness in the way that I think Marx maybe does some of this stuff is that I wish there was more focus on intra class conflict. I think like some of that stuff's there, but the aspirate like the communist politics and the aspirations probably like occludes a lot of that. But I mean, yeah. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Mike, Nietzsche, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
Um, I mean, I feel like we're still not getting to the bottom of it because I feel like Knightley is kind of agreeing that class struggle and class conflict are useful for understanding history, and I'm just wondering because, like, to me, it seems like Marx's goal is to use class conflict to just understand the specific like point in history and what the main like
Well,
classes that are at play given the like mode of production that we live under. Like, do you reject the idea of a mode of production as well? Maybe that would be a good question.
well, that would depend on how you define mode of production. But to step back, I'm saying that the narrative of class warfare is useful only in perpetuating Marx's belief. His uh, to expand on that a little, its usefulness is not tied to reality. My point is that class struggle, the way he describes it, is not real. The reason I get to that is we describe lots of things that aren't real, and we do so usefully. Some subtly, like I think it's centrifugal force, because there's centrifugal and there's centripetal. And one, while we describe it, isn't real. It's a misunderstanding of what we're observing.
Yeah, but I think that in this case, it seems as though you agree that there are aspects of it that are useful or have explanatory power still.
Yeah, I never denied that they weren't useful. I just said they weren't real.
Yeah,
Right.
but like if they have explanatory power and they're useful for understanding history in some way, I don't know how you can go all out and saying that they're not real. Like
So so can I,
to me that's a misnomer.
Well, Chronicles of Narnia is useful for understanding Christianity, but it's not real either.
well, okay. I see. This is I think and I'm not sure if I touched on this at all, but it's something I think is, in any sense, like any social abstraction isn't real, but that doesn't mean it doesn't also, like, it doesn't condition individual behavior. I mean, the fact that I live the fact one traffic isn't made by one car, you know, but it's a collective phenomena. But one car can get caught up in the fact that and there's no there might not be a clear distinction from when there's no traffic to when there's traffic, but you know, like in the same way, I'm inclined to say that even though class is kind of like a social, like an abstraction, it's an abstraction with explanatory power, and one that like explains elements of our actual life. I mean, for instance, the wealth disparity, for one, or the fact that we can't seem to make headway on confronting the ecological crisis. I mean, when you say class struggle is a myth, like to my mind, Marx just said that capital is trying to commodify labor power within the workplace, and is doing so by the implementation of technology and the attempt to push down on the costs of production. And I feel like that's going to be really relevant in the case of some of the if any of the automation hype bears fruit. um, we'll probably see those kinds of dynamics.
Yes, and we won't see them along strictly class lines.
I mean, do you what do you think about people who organize a labor union in this historical moment, I guess? Do you view that as a mostly fruitless effort, or do you think it offers um, advantages for employees? I guess what's your general take on those kinds of activities?
Uh, I think worker unions do a lot of good. They just run into they just have to be careful. If they push too far, they end up causing damage because they have a different objective than the business itself.
Right. Um, I guess that's my point. Like when you when you have an institution that's capable of bargaining with employers, they don't share the same interests. Like there is that element of just basic class struggle taking place between employers and employees. Again, I don't think that necessarily explains everything because we
Well,
still have like market
that's
competition.
that's also an abstraction because most employers aren't Amazon or something like that.
For sure. I
We're
mean,
getting to that point, but most of the time, especially over the last 100 years or so, most employers were on the same class, had the same material needs as the people they were hiring.
um, when you say same material needs, could you unpack that a little?
Uh, they had similar amounts of money. They were trying to get the similar size homes, buying from the same grocery stores, that kind of stuff.
Okay. So you do think that there's been a divergence between rich and poor over the last number of decades? Um, it kind of says you see like that there actually is like a more stark divide now. Am I mishearing you?
Mm, no, you're not mishearing me. There's
Okay.
definitely a stark divide, but it's not as strictly class based as it
Right.
appears to be. And the
Right.
classes that are there, if you want to organize them that way, aren't united.
Right.
And with only a few exceptions, they don't have that class identity.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of that. Um, I like for one thing, say like in the US, um, we have this kind of thing called the middle class, which is kind of like a never clearly defined either. But I mean, there are tangible places between having nothing but your labor power to sell and people who own capital and who hire people. There's a lot of administration. There is home ownership, which ties you into real estate markets and I think ways that are underappreciated for understanding a lot of our politics. I think I don't disagree with your point. That elite cleave into like uh scruffy Charles Dickens characters. But but I do see like congealed economic interests that are um at opposition, often driving not everything about uh, uh what's going on in the world, but like pretty significant amounts.
Well, I don't see them as always being oppositional. That's part of the thing.
Okay.
Um, I'm trying to think of good ways to describe it. Like a lot of
Do
what.
you Sorry,
Go
go
on.
ahead. No, no, no. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll put a pin in my question.
Well, I was still struggling to put it all together. But
Can I ask? Do you think government and estates and say business or capital do you think they're always oppositional? Um,
business, do I think business and states are always oppositional?
yeah.
No.
Okay. I uh I guess I mean like uh I don't necessarily there's kind of like two ways of saying. There's a way in which I think that labor and capital are always oppositional, and then there's a way in which I don't. And I guess, like I said before about the commodification of labor in within the production process, I do think in some sense that's always oppositional. But like your boss can, or your company can give you like a really sweet deal relative to what most people are living with. I mean, like that's a very real sense in which you feel like you're being done right by and that it's a fair exchange taking place. Like I would never want to deny that, and I would never want to deny that. Like there's also a range of people who uh, maybe are a one man business, and they both they're both labor and capital in that equation. But that's not. I think Marx's point is that's not when everything's left to its own or holding everything constant. The tendency of capital is to sort of drive those two things apart, and um, and for what could just be factors of production, labor and capital end up becoming congealed class formations to some extent. Um, just as a tendency of the economy, not without any sort of outside exogenous intervention. That I guess that's kind of how I think about it. But
No, I get I see where you're coming from. I mean, for to a certain extent, I see where Marx is coming from as well.
right, I don't know if I'm the most faithful interpreter here of Marx. I can only and nor am I even necessarily um, because I mean there are other people who've said interesting things about class who aren't Marxists. I mean um, Veblen, who talked about conspicuous consumption. Um, you know, uh, Max Weber, wrote really smart stuff on class, and I just wouldn't want to. The idea of society having sort of congealed economic interests in opposition with one another being a driving force in history is just not an idea. That's kind of the thing I want to hold on to, I guess. Not that it necessarily is totalizing, but I think Marx would try to say that capitalism has that expansive, constantly uh, devouring sort of quality to try to commodify as much as it can. But
Yeah, what he was seeing was the increase in scale. But what changed a lot in that period was we also saw wealth of the poorest people increase vastly.
do you I mean here's a what do you think the relation between I guess uh, you know like it's probably like I know you're like 3 hours later than me, so I feel really shitty asking you at this hour to like expand on global political economy. But do you think how do you reconcile, say, like the colonial practices of governments undergoing the like development in the sense that we're talking about? Because I totally agree with you, like in a sense that a massive amount of wealth had been created in that period, but like you know Marx thought the same. I mean, that's not Marx admired capitalism's ability to create commodities. Um,
Yeah,
so
he even said it was necessary.
I mean, so that's I guess like that's kind of uh I mean to some extent like it's not good enough to say that um development was happening. You know, we need to like focus on also like the unevenness of that development. And, you know, that also includes that like in Bengal in the 1870s, uh, grain markets were exporting rice out of a famine, you know, to feed uh, English industrialization.
Yeah, and I'm not defending all the practices. My point is that it's not all oppositional because
Okay.
everybody benefited. Well, especially in the countries in question, everybody benefited. Yes, that doesn't mean colonialism was all good, but it's not a simple saying that the capitalists gained and the lower class lost. They didn't. They gained a lot too.
I mean, I just as a historical matter, um, I've been going over a lot of the literature on this as part of a master's dissertation, and you're like there was eventually a gain, no doubt, but there was also a period of real stagnation and immiseration that took place in the early industrial period, and it lasted several generations by some estimates. I mean, um, class struggle as a notion predates Marx. I mean, it's you know you see it in like the Luddite movement and machine breaking, and while in some sense we can be grateful, and I think even like perversely like um, Marx might have been grateful that like the productive forces won out. You know, it's not the case that the people who lost out in that equation ever really recovered. You know, and so I don't know. I mean, I'm not here saying we should like bring back gas lamp lighters because the light bulb was such a drag or anything like that. At the same time, you know, we say we all benefit. We have to like unpack that a little bit more. I mean, you know, the cotton gin certainly didn't benefit Southern slaves, uh, even if it, you know, made the production of linens easier in Europe.
No, that it did not.
Did we are we reaching an impasse here where I mean it seems like Knightley just doesn't want to or sorry, it seems like Knightley's just disagreeing with the use value of theory at this point, right? Like it
No,
seems like
I've never disagreed with the use of it. I'm just saying that it's not an accurate depiction of reality.
I mean, then Chase, you also agree with that in some sense, right? But you think it's useful because it does in fact reflect something about reality. That's why it's
Right.
useful, right?
Well, I mean, it reflects something about social reality. I mean, and like social, you know, I mean, like you know, all this shit is made. Like you know, I hate to like just sound like a post-structuralist or something, but like you know, property's made up. Like all this shit is made up. Like these are just, you know, this is just like the set of social conventions, institutions, norms that, you know, we bring. I guess the fundamental disagreement that I have with Knightley is I just don't think the way we currently live uh, was in some like primitive form prior to 1800. Um, so I think that might just be like a sort of historical like hermeneutic and methodological difference about how we're approaching this topic. But like, yeah, I do think to the extent that anything we do socially is real, I think it describes aspects of social life accurately. Not everything. I mean, you have to get granular sometimes and talk about like a municipal budget, but
Okay, well, I think maybe we could leave it off there then. I think the arguments have been made. I'll end the recording and we can just have a free form discussion till from there. Just let me
Sounds good.
yeah.